In the wheat belt of Western Australia, in the spring of 1932, farmers around the district of Campion watched their fields disappear under a wave of birds. Not a handful. Not a few hundred. Something like 20,000 emus, Australia's largest native bird, standing well over head height on some of the smaller farmers, migrating inland after their breeding season, discovered that newly cleared farmland made for excellent grazing, and excellent places to trample straight through fences on their way to water. The farmers, many of them veterans who had fought in the First World War and been given this land afterward, watched their crops get flattened and their fences torn down, day after day, week after week, with no end in sight. Eventually, exhausted and out of options, they did the only thing that seemed to make sense to them at the time. They asked the government to send in the army. To understand why that request even seemed reasonable, you need to understand who these farmers were. After the war, the Australian government had handed out plots of land in Western Australia to returning soldiers, encouraging them to take up farming, often on marginal, difficult ground that had never been properly farmed before. The scheme that gave them this land was called the Soldier Settlement Scheme, and it had already been struggling for years, since much of the land simply wasn't very good for farming in the first place, drought-prone and difficult to clear. Rabbits had already been a persistent menace across the region for decades. Now here came thousands of emus on top of everything else, and for men who had already survived years of war only to spend years fighting the land itself just to make ends meet, it must have felt like one hardship too many. Emus are not small animals, either. A fully grown emu stands taller than most people's waist, sometimes close to 2 meters including the neck, and can move at a speed few land animals in Australia can match. To farmers already stretched thin, this genuinely looked like an emergency worth involving the military. The Australian government agreed, and treated it, at least on paper, like an actual military operation. Command was given to Major Gwyndd Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery, sent out with 2 soldiers, 2 Lewis machine guns, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. A Lewis gun could fire somewhere around 10 rounds a second. On paper, against birds, this looked less like pest control and more like overkill. The request had gone up through the Minister of Defence's office, and after some deliberation, permission was granted. It's worth pausing on how unusual that decision actually was. This wasn't pest control contractors, or local hunters, or park rangers being sent out. This was the actual Australian military, deployed against wildlife, using automatic weapons designed to stop advancing infantry, not scatter birds. Reporters were even invited along, expecting to document a quick, decisive victory. Nobody involved seems to have seriously questioned whether it would actually work. Why would they? It was 3 armed men with machine guns, against birds. On the 2nd of November, 1932, Meredith's unit got its first real chance. The unit had traveled out to the district specifically for this engagement, full of confidence. Emus, after all, cannot fly, and don't exactly have a reputation as fast or cunning animals in most people's minds. That confidence lasted for as long as it took the first burst of gunfire to go off. A group of around 50 emus was spotted in open ground, well within range. The soldiers opened fire. And almost immediately, the entire plan fell apart. The emus didn't panic in a straight line, the way livestock might. They scattered instantly, in every direction, changing pace and direction unpredictably, and it turned out to be almost impossible to hit a moving target that erratic with a fixed machine gun. A handful of birds went down. The rest simply vanished into the scrub. It was the first sign that this was not going to be the quick job anyone had promised. 2 days later, the soldiers tried something smarter, an ambush. They staked out a position near a local dam, reasoning that thirsty emus would eventually have to come to them. It worked, almost too well. More than 1,000 birds approached the position at once, more than the soldiers had seen gathered in one place during the entire operation. And then, at the exact moment they needed it most, one of the Lewis guns jammed. It had fired only 12 rounds. By the time the gun was cleared, the flock had already scattered and fled, and the single greatest opportunity of the whole campaign was gone, just like that. It's the kind of failure that becomes almost cinematic in hindsight, the largest, most promising target of the entire campaign, arriving right on cue, directly into a prepared position, undone by a single mechanical fault at the worst possible second. What the soldiers were discovering, slowly and expensively, was that emus are genuinely difficult targets. They can run at speeds approaching 50 kilometers an hour. They change direction almost instantly, without any warning. And accounts from the operation describe emus appearing to post lookouts, watching for danger while the rest of the flock fed, scattering the moment any threat appeared. Some later writers have pushed back on the idea that emus were consciously outsmarting trained soldiers, pointing out that panicked scattering is simply a normal defensive response for a prey animal in open country. But regardless of the explanation, the practical result was the same either way. Birds that were supposed to be an easy, stationary target were behaving like a much harder one, and the men on the ground were beginning to suspect they weren't dealing with a simple pest problem so much as an opponent that understood the terrain better than they did. Word of how badly things were going reached the press, and the press had an absolute field day with it. Newspapers reported that only a handful of birds had been killed for a huge expenditure of ammunition, and the story of trained soldiers with machine guns being outmaneuvered by birds proved simply too good a story not to print. Commentary at the time didn't hold back either, with critics pointing out that if the operation's own numbers were to be believed, this was one of the least efficient uses of military ammunition in the country's history, all directed at an enemy that, notably, was not shooting back. By the 8th of November, the matter was being raised in the Australian House of Representatives itself. Amid the mounting public embarrassment, the Minister of Defence, Sir George Pearce, ordered the operation withdrawn entirely. After only 6 days, the military's war on the emus was, officially, over. Major Meredith gave his own account of what they had actually been up against, and it's become one of the most quoted lines in Australian military history. To be fair to him, he wasn't making excuses lightly. He was a decorated artillery officer trying to explain, in a serious government report, why a fully armed detachment couldn't get the upper hand on birds, and he clearly felt he owed his men, and himself, a real explanation. He compared the emus to a Zulu impi, noted their extraordinary maneuverability even while badly wounded, and said, quote, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They could face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks," end quote. A senior artillery officer, writing an official government report, was comparing farmland pest birds to armored vehicles. That alone tells you almost everything about how the operation had actually gone. But the emus were still there, and the crop damage hadn't stopped for even a single day. Farmers hadn't stopped lobbying either. Whatever embarrassment the government felt about the first attempt, the underlying problem, thousands of emus still tearing through crops, hadn't gone anywhere, and the political pressure to be seen doing something about it hadn't gone anywhere either. Within days, the government reversed itself again. On the 12th of November, the Minister of Defence approved sending the military back out into the field. The second campaign ran from the 13th of November all the way through to the 10th of December, nearly a full month, considerably longer than the first attempt had lasted. The early days went noticeably better this time, something like 40 birds killed in the first 2 days alone, as the soldiers adapted their tactics. But sustaining that kind of success against a population that size was an entirely different matter. When Major Meredith was finally recalled on the 10th of December, he filed a report claiming 986 confirmed kills, using 9,860 rounds of ammunition. That works out to almost exactly 10 rounds fired for every single confirmed kill, a suspiciously tidy number for a chaotic, month-long operation spread across open farmland, and one that later writers have treated with a healthy amount of skepticism. For context, the unit had been issued 10,000 rounds in total at the very start of the operation. According to Meredith's own numbers, they'd fired all but a small fraction of it. Whatever else you make of the campaign, by the time it ended, this was not a unit that had held anything back. But even taking the figure entirely at face value, it barely mattered in the end. The estimated emu population in the region was around 20,000 birds. Even 1,000 confirmed kills was little more than a rounding error against numbers like that. This time, the government did not send the military back out a third time. Whatever appetite there had been for treating a farmland pest problem like a military campaign was completely gone. It's worth noting that this wasn't really anyone specifically admitting failure out loud. There was no dramatic resignation, no official apology. The file was simply closed, and responsibility for the emu problem was quietly handed back to the people who had been dealing with it all along, the farmers themselves. The Great Emu War, as it came to be known almost immediately, both at the time and ever since, quietly ended, not with any kind of decisive victory, but with everyone involved simply agreeing, without much discussion, not to try that particular approach again. Machine guns, it turned out, were never really going to be the answer here. So what actually worked? Not the army. A bounty system had already existed quietly in Western Australia since 1923, paying ordinary farmers and hunters for every emu they culled themselves, without press coverage, without parliamentary debate, without a single machine gun involved. The system was straightforward. Farmers or hunters would bring in evidence of a cull, typically emu beaks, in exchange for a small cash payment per bird. No dramatic operation with a name attached to it, just steady, unglamorous, distributed effort, repeated by hundreds of individual people, week after week. After the military's very public failure, that existing bounty system simply continued on in the background, and it turned out to be dramatically more effective than 2 machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition had ever managed to be. In a single 6-month period in 1934, 57,034 bounties were claimed. Ordinary farmers, working the problem individually and consistently, achieved in months what a formal military operation couldn't manage in weeks. Nearly a century later, the Great Emu War has become something close to a national joke, routinely cited as the time Australia went to war with a bird and technically came out the loser. The phrase still gets cited today, sometimes seriously, sometimes as an internet joke, whenever people want a shorthand example of a mismatched fight going sideways. But underneath the punchline is a genuinely useful lesson that shows up again and again throughout military history. Overwhelming firepower doesn't automatically beat an opponent that's fast, unpredictable, and almost impossible to pin down in a straight line, even when that opponent is, in this particular case, a very large, very confused, very determined bird. Whichever way you want to take it, the basic facts remain exactly as strange as they sound. Australia had the machine guns. The emus had numbers, speed, and absolutely no idea they were ever supposed to lose.